afternoon. A huge welcome to get it right, Amanda, who's in Greece, and hopefully the very windy weather there isn't going to cause her internet to freeze too often. The reason for doing this principally is, well, you all know Amanda, she's the editor of The Circular and a particular specialist on South American wines, and her new book is been out very recently and is much acclaimed. It's a wonderful book, so she'll tell us a bit about that. But the principal subject of her talk is Criolla grapes, which are the oldest grapes in South America. I think they are. We'll know after this session anyway. Amanda, over to you.
Amanda's muted at the moment.
Yeah, sorry. I apologize, first of all, because my internet connection is not fantastic. So if I do pause, I'm very sorry, and please let me know if I need to repeat anything. Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you very much for having me here to talk about Criolla. It's a subject that I'm very passionate about, so I can't wait to dive in. I'll try and share my screen, and hopefully this will work okay. So we're going to look at this whole family of Criolla varieties, which are very much the oldest varieties in South America. And it's a big focus of my new book on South American wine, which you can find out more information online at my website, southamericawineguide.com. And in there, I've really kind of gone into depth with all the major wine regions, but looking at both the modern and new wine styles, as well as some of the kind of most authentic and traditional ones, which I think Criolla really embodies. So first, to kind of have an overview of how these wines arrived to South America. South America is one of the kind of oldest New World wine continents, and vines first arrived with Columbus's second voyage in 1493, when they brought with them a handful of different varieties, including notably Listan Prieto and Moscatel de Alejandria, which we're going to touch on a bit later, as well as other cultivars, olive trees, wheat, for example. And from that Caribbean island, which was known as Hispaniola at the time, these vines traveled up as people started to colonize and settle. So they went up through Mexico and to North America, and through the Caribbean, actually through Venezuela, down to South America, and then also coming through the ports. So Peru being one of the most important historic wine countries of South America, starting in the 1540s. And the importance of Peru at the time was obviously that's where the viceroyalty was seated. And so they would make their wine in order to fit with their lifestyle and both through Peru and also through the ports of La Serena and Concepcion, and then in Argentina over the Andes from Bolivia and from Chile, as well as from the port of Buenos Aires, and what was kind of the invasion of the Portuguese in Brazil at the time, where they also started producing wine, but not very successfully at that period because of the humid climate. We didn't really see viticulture kick off until the mid-1800s in Brazil. And Uruguay did have some Criolla varieties, but sadly it gets a bit neglected by history because most of the time we only talk about Uruguayan wine once the country.
You've frozen again, Amanda.
Uruguay as well. So to give you an idea of what Criolla is, Criolla is a term you can use Creole in the US, which means born of a Hispanic heritage, but born in the Americas. And so we talk about food being Criolla, we talk about people being Criolla, or traditions and cultures. And then we also give this whole family of grapes the name Criolla. And it can be a bit confusing because you can use it as a singular to describe one of many grape varieties, or you can use it as the kind of plural, the grape kind of Criolla family. And so the two main ones that really started this Criolla family were Listan Prieto and Moscatel de Alejandria. And there were a couple others that arrived in the same period, Mollar being one. And from those, this whole massive web of varieties, native varieties, were born in the Americas, and we're going to explore some of them as we look at the different wine regions. I know that some people have a couple wines to taste along with, which I am going to mention, but if you've tasted any Criolla wines, that can include Torrontés or País, which are the most accessible at the moment, then please do kind of get involved and share your thoughts on them, and also let me know which wines you've tasted. Hopefully I will have tried them. I think I've tasted most of them, as they are my go-to summer drink in Argentina and Chile. But also what's interesting about this, like Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, we get some crossings happening from that period. So Criolla #1 is one of those interesting new kind of Criolla varieties that comes from a crossing of Malbec with Criolla Grande, which is a second generation native variety. So one thing I really like to highlight in South America is the great quantity of old vines that we have. And I think Australia has done an excellent job of marketing their old vines and classifying them. And so when they talk about the 70-year-old survivor vines, or plus 70 years, I've just pulled up this comparison, which really kind of shows that Chile and Argentina do have a great wealth of these very old vines. The South Africa data is only from 35 years. So I don't know how much of that would be over 75, but we do have considerable numbers of old vines that are well over 75 and often into their hundreds and up to 250 years old, some of the oldest that I've encountered. So we're going to start in Peru, which, as I said, was the first real wine country of South America and the kind of birthplace of the wine industry as a commercial industry. And so very much the wine production really started near Cusco, actually, because that's where the colonizers really tried to take seat and take over. But most of the wine regions developed towards the coast. So in Ica, which is on the map there in purple, that was the main wine region, and further south, Moquegua, Tacna, which is on the border of Chile, also was very important, and Arequipa, but several earthquakes have kind of unfortunately reduced their wine industries quite significantly. But we still have a big grape growing industry in Peru, and not only for wine, but predominantly for pisco and also for table grapes. So this hectarage includes all of those. And what is interesting is that when the Viceroyalty got jealous of the wine production in Peru in the 1600s and 1700s and started banning their production of wine. And so that's what made Peru switch over to pisco production. And many of these Criolla grape varieties are still used in pisco production. But they're also, we're seeing a really interesting renaissance of making Criolla wines in Peru, and often looking back at some of the most traditional winemaking methods. So looking at the use of botijas, which are their own amphoras, which they used to use to export their wine to Spain and to Europe, and ship it between Chile as well. And some of those kind of more artisanal, natural wine methods. And I've included this picture of Coye, it's a restaurant in Lima, because I think what's been really influential in the Peru's wine scene in the last decade have been these incredible restaurants in Lima, very fine dining cuisine. Central is a great example, where they've really started to put an emphasis on local wines, on looking for Peruvian wines. And actually the sommeliers have been very instrumental in going out to the wineries and the wine regions and encouraging producers to embrace their own identity, which are these Criolla varieties. And Peru is an incredible country to visit anyway, especially because the food is so wonderful. But it is a really kind of interesting wine region too, because you get these extreme vineyards just right on the coast and in the middle of sand dunes. And it makes it very kind of memorable and an interesting place to visit. The main Criolla varieties that we talk about in Peru are the Pisco 7. It's now a Pisco 8, but I won't go into that because the 8th one is a hybrid, so not so interesting for today. But the big 7 Pisco varieties, which are all Criolla varieties, Quebranta is a really interesting native variety, which you'll pretty much only find in Peru. And it's used at the moment for quite light red wines or deep rosés. It might appear more that way. And you get quite an earthy and textural profile from that. Albilla, which is actually Palomino. So that's not a Criolla variety, but it's one that came with those first founding varieties over 500 years ago. So we consider it part of that family. And there's been some interesting developments in Ica with actually making Palomino underfloor. So its own kind of Peruvian sherry in some ways. Italia, which is actually Moscatel de Alejandria, which gives us those very fruity and fragrant wines. Moscatel, some of these names are going to get confusing because they're all very similar but very different grape varieties. But Moscatel, which is actually a native variety in Peru, again making very fragrant wines. Negro Mollar, which is their name for Negro Mol, which you'll still find in the Canaries, and Negro Criolla, which is the name for that original Listan Prieto, which gives us those kind of red, juicy red wines, which we're going to talk about a bit later. And then Torrontel, again, is another one of their native Criolla varieties. And all of these are made into wine, but also you're most likely to taste them in Pisco. And it can be quite interesting to taste them vinified or distilled as separate varieties too. Moving over to Bolivia, and if anyone has any questions, then please just unmute yourself and jump in. Bolivia being the wine region that really kind of developed from the growth of Peru, and especially for the discovery of the Potosi mine, Cerro Rico, which is still one of the most important silver mines in the world, I believe. And when this huge population of European settlers moved there in order to get rich in the New World, they needed something to drink. And so Peru's wine industry really increased in order to supply them. But Bolivia also significantly developed its own wine industry. And if you look at the map, Sinti, which is that kind of blue line marked with number 1, is not too far from Potosi. It's not an easy journey by any means. Bolivia is never very easy to travel in, but it is good fun. But that Sinti Valley really developed as a place to make wine for the miners at Potosi and the rich families that would summer in Sinti while kind of, you know, having their mines in Potosi. And so that, and then further south in Tarija, which is just above Salta, those are our real kind of heartlands for old vines in Bolivia. But Tarija is largely a new wine region that really boomed since the 1960s, although there are some old and interesting Criolla vines there. And then up north, we've got the Santa Cruz valleys, where we also get some Criolla vines and some kind of more international varieties and modern production too.
Amanda, before you go any further, are you able to put that onto full screen, the PDF? Because at the moment we can see the right hand edit tool. When you put it on earlier, you just had the full screen.
Maybe I shared the wrong screen. Let me give it a go.
Edit on the right column, so you can't really see the maps as well. But don't worry, if you can't, don't worry.
Hold on, it's no problem. I think I was sharing the wrong one. Let's see if I can do this one. Is that full?
That's better, much better. Yeah.
Perfect. So for me, the most exciting Criolla grape variety to taste from Bolivia is Moscatel de Alejandria, which was one of those first varieties that came in the 1500s or 1400s from Spain. And what I love about Moscatel de Alejandria in Bolivia is the way that it's grown is harking back to the original way that the Jesuits would plant hundreds of years ago, using trees as their training system. So they grow around these incredible pink peppercorn trees called molle, and often chañar as well, which is an interesting kind of herb. And so when you get the Moscatel, which can be, you know, quite transparent in flavor, it picks up a lot of that kind of sweet pink peppercorn notes, and sometimes those kind of herbaceous notes of chañar, which can give you quite a complex wine. And also because of the age of these vines, they kind of err more on that earthy rather than that incredible kind of floral nose that you're so used to from younger Moscatel. And so I really urge anyone, if they're ever in Bolivia, to try some of the Moscatel de Alejandria, especially from the Sinti Valley. But also you get some really nice of the Misionera, which is their País or Listan Prieto, and other Criolla vines that grow around these trees. And that's typically the way that they are grown both in Tarija and in Sinti. And other varieties that we have there is Vistroqueña, which is a very interesting, purely Bolivian Criolla variety, which has quite kind of light tannins and relatively high acidity and a paler color. So it's, you know, some sommeliers there like to compare it to their Nebbiolo or Pinot Noir. I'm not sure which one it would fall into, but it is a really interesting and delicious wine, of which I hope we're going to see a lot more of in the export market soon. And then Negra Criolla, which is also called Misionera, although there are likely different varieties. It's not very well documented in Bolivia yet, which is that Listan Prieto. We've also got Torrontés, Pedro Jiménez, and Cereza, which we'll touch on now with Argentina. And all of those varieties, Moscatel de Alejandria is also used in their Singani, so their own brandy, which is delicious, very kind of pure, crisp, and focused brandy. And so moving on to Argentina, and here we've got, this is Francisco from El Esteco. He's under a huge trees of Torrontés in the north of Argentina. And Argentina has had their Criolla vines proliferate throughout the country. So wherever the kind of Andean corridor lies, wine regions really developed, straight from Jujuy in the north, all the way down to, well, the kind of reaches of Rio Negro in the south originally. And in all of those wine regions, we have Criolla grape varieties that have been there for hundreds of years. And often very old vines still remaining because they're quite hardy and they can handle the climate very nicely, and are quite drought tolerant as well. And so Argentina is very much a titan of the wine world. It's the biggest in South America in terms of hectares and usually in terms of production as well. And we've got this huge diversity of native varieties that have been born there. But the most important, not in terms of number, but certainly in terms of reputation, is Torrontés. And Torrontés is in fact 3 different varieties. The one that we most often taste in fine wines is Torrontés Riojano. And that's where we get those typically very flamboyant jasmine and lychee notes coming through, and sometimes quite tropical notes or citrusy notes as well. And it was really in the 90s that Torrontés has kind of seen its major quality revolution, largely at the hands of Susana Balbo in the north. It's kind of interesting with Argentina because a lot of winemakers from Mendoza were sent to the north in order to kind of earn their reputation in order to be able to come back to Mendoza. It was not seen as a very desirable place to be making wine, but actually I think more and more winemakers now are looking to work in the Calchaquí valleys because it is such an interesting terroir to work from. And you do get this very distinctive personality of Torrontés from there. And what I think is interesting about Torrontés is now that everyone's kind of vinifying it normally in quite a similar way, where you're looking at kind of stainless steel, cool fermentations for that kind of crisp and clean style, you can see some real kind of regional variation, which is very interesting, from the north and down to the south. So typically, I think in the Calchaquí valleys, you get those very intense floral aromas. about in one of the wines that some people are tasting today. But you've also got lots of innovation happening within Dorontes in terms of using it for orange wines, and also starting to oak quite sensitively with Dorontes. So again, Susana Balbo is a good example of a nice oaked one. Chacana make a nice unfiltered Dorontes as well with skin contact. So that can be quite interesting. And the wine that some of us hopefully are able to taste today is from Chacana and from Luján de Cuyo, so from Mendoza. And I've just pulled up this comment from Julia Harding as a tasting note. And I think what's really interesting about this is that there's absolutely no mention of the Dorontes floral notes in these comments. And I think that shows quite aptly the difference that we get from Mendocinian Dorontes and it typically being more kind of citrusy or kind of white blossom in the Uco Valley. And so for me, it's really interesting to start comparing some of the Dorontes from, for example, Mendoza's Luján, the Uco Valley and the Calchaquí valleys, where you can see quite marked differences. And I definitely recommend kind of seeking out different Dorontes to explore the different expressions you get, because it is a very unique variety which actually has been very well absorbed by the markets and now is available in most supermarkets, which in the UK at least, which I think is a great achievement for a Criolla variety. Vamos Criolla. Anyway, this is
saying that we were saying that the back label of the Chacana states it's from Uco Valley.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, not
okay.
Really.
I believed it was from their Agrello production. But Sophie Jumper's on the call, so she can correct me. Yeah. But yeah, the Uco Valley and Luján are both kind of really, they're planting new Dorontes in the Uco Valley, which I think is particularly interesting because it shows that focus now on actually planting more Criolla rather than just kind of using the old vines. They also have it in their Agrello vineyard, and both can make some interesting Dorontes. And there's also plenty in the east, which is the real kind of heartland of Dorontes and Mendoza, and also San Juan and La Rioja further north, a very kind of so some of the other important Criolla varieties to know from Argentina, first and foremost, and the one that almost no one ever knows, is Cereza, which is actually the second most planted variety in Argentina. So enormous land under hectare with Cereza, and that's a kind of light red, pink-skinned variety. I could hear someone saying something, but it's come through very unclearly for me.
It's Sophie Jump. I've just muted. I've tried to mute it. I'm not sure she's having trouble connecting. So
yeah, I couldn't hear that, unfortunately. Sophie, if you want to add it into the chat, I'm not sure if it was my internet or
no, I can't
or
hear
yours. So Cereza is normally still kind of used mainly for bulk wines or for local wines and rarely bottled under its own name. However, there are a couple producers starting to work with Cereza as a very kind of light, juicy, fragrant summer wine. The Duriguti brothers, I think, are a really nice example of that. Criollo Grande is very important in terms of quantity as well. And that's a native one born in Argentina, and a lighter red variety, again offering quite kind of fragrant, juicy wines with typically quite strawberry aromas. Dorontes we've mentioned, and then Pedro Jimenez is interesting because it's absolutely unrelated, nothing to do with the Pedro Jimenez we might know from southern Spain, but it's a native Criolla variety and a very light-bodied and quite simple but enjoyable in its simplicity, and used for kind of nice, crisp, fresh wines that you can enjoy in the summertime. And also there's an interesting kind of movement to using Pedro Jimenez again for sherry style wines, which were a tradition in Argentina before. Moscatel Rosado, another native variety, a pink kind of muscat, used for rosé wines, Moscatel de Alejandria being that original vine, and then we've got some other varieties in smaller proportions as well. Criolla Chica being one, which is what we'll be tasting coming from a cross with Malbec, which gives you much more color, Criolla numero uno, than the typical other Criolla varieties, because Malbec obviously is so purple. So the second wine that I wanted to highlight today is the Matadiana Criolla from Catena, which I think is really interesting because it shows not only this return to Criolla, but also this intention to give more value back to the east of Mendoza. So the grapes for this come from Rivadavia, which is a really important wine region in terms of quantity and history. It's actually where the Catena family started and where they built their wine empire and their, very successful business. And it's where many of the wineries of Mendoza, the bigger ones, actually started in the east and then have been gradually kind of moving towards Luján de Cuyo and the Uco Valley. And so I think this kind of embodies a nice movement to looking towards the east of Mendoza and seeing what we can do with that huge number of old vines that are there and all the families and growers that it supports. And so this one's very nice to try also because it's gone back to artisanal production in terms of using 200 years old, I believe, clay pots, which were also typical at that time. And I think if you are able to compare this with a Chilean Pais, it's the same variety, you'll see some quite interesting differences, which is often in the east, you get this much kind of softer, more supple fruit, and you don't get that kind of touch of tannic spine that you'll more commonly get in Chile's Pais, which is largely due to kind of the climates, but also I think quite significantly due to the way that these are grown. So this is a really nice one that's done very well in the UK in the on-trade and kind of shows the family looking back to kind of older areas of production and older methods of production and really bringing it forward. And I know Gaucho, for example, in the UK has been really instrumental in purchasing and giving value to a lot of these Criolla wines, which I think I applaud it. I think it's a really kind of nice, interesting way to boost the industry. So well worth looking out for that. And moving over to Chile, which is really where we've got the heartland of Pais, the Criolla Chica that we were just talking about, which is Listan Prieto. And we've got these Criolla vines in Chile, again, all the way from the north down to quite far in the south. You've got some old Criolla vines in the Araucanía province, which is really quite far south. And not used much for viticulture today, but it was, hundreds of years ago, and is now kind of beginning to see a renaissance. Malleco further is becoming a real hotspot for viticulture, and then we've got some interesting developments down in Osorno. But in terms of the Criolla varieties, we're really kind of looking mainly at Maule, Itata, and Bio Bio, where you've got these huge kind of plantations of Pais and some other Criolla varieties too. But it's important to know that the history of Chile's wine production is all over the country, and actually on those regions that border Peru, you still get some very interesting Moscatel being made into, and Criolla Negra being made into sweet wines, so often dried on bamboo mats and then pressed to make a nice dessert wine. And in a tradition that they've been doing for hundreds of years, similar to how they have some similar wines over the other side on Peru as well. So a focus on Pais, which I think is certainly next to Torontes, the most important Criolla variety that is really kind of beginning to take a little space in the export market, and hopefully will continue to improve. So Pais being one of the first vines brought here to the Americas, and still, you know, with over 10,000 hectares in Chile. Most of these are very old vines. Some producers are beginning to explore planting new vines of Pais in order to see how it reacts and really kind of understand more deeply the variety. And also we're seeing a big movement towards using Pais as new root stocks for other varieties, because it has this incredible drought resistance and also resistance to nematodes too, which is very important in Chile. And so typically Pais, you get slightly kind of spicy tannins. Some people might call it slightly rustic, but the winemaking has changed quite significantly recently in order to go with much lighter extractions so that you don't get so much of that kind of tannic grip. And the wine that we have today, certainly for me, doesn't have too much tannic grip, but you get a kind of soft acidity, but producers are normally picking a lot earlier to kind of maintain that freshness. And you always get this lovely red. And so for me, kind of tasting Pais is a really interesting exercise to do in Maule, Etata, and Bio Bio, because you get quite different profiles. And some winemakers, so Bouchon, for example, has Pais from all three. And so it's quite a nice kind of way to explore the differences through that. Many of the producers of Pais are still using very artisanal techniques. So going back to, if I pull up this one, to pressing with Zaranda, or destemming, sorry, with Zaranda, which is this bamboo mat, which was a old technique that they used and they still continue to use in many of these smaller wineries, but also bigger wineries like Torres are bringing it back in. Aging in Rowley vats is also something that's really significant in the production of Pais, and Rowley is a native wood, it's a beech, I believe, in Chile. So again, giving quite a different profile to the wines, but in an interesting and inviting way. And the kind of age of these vines are also phenomenal. So this one here on the right is in Etata, and I believe it's 1792. I have to look up exactly when it was planted, but this vineyard is still productive. It goes towards a wine by Leo Arasso called A los Viñeteros Bravos, who Angela will know very well. And we also have these incredible old head train vines in Maule, as well as some more wild Pais vines. So this one here being harvested where the Pais has grown around the trees in Bouchon's estate in Maule. And so what is interesting and important, in my opinion, about Pais in Chile is not only these old vines, but also the impact that Pais has in terms of the social impact, having, you know, supporting thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of families that grow these old vines and have these very small plots. And it's their income and their livelihood, but also the kind of cultural significance of looking back to their own vinification techniques and really focusing on their pipeño tradition, which is the local wines that they would make and drink in the south. And Chile, as you might be aware, does not have the same strong wine culture that you get in Argentina. Consumption is much lower. And so in the south, some of these wine traditions have been maintained, and it's a world away from other areas of Chile. You know, if you're driving around most of Chile, you would barely see a wine store, but in the south, you still have people selling it outside their houses and in little kiosks on the corner of the road. And I think that kind of cultural importance of wine is really significant for kind of maintaining and also the way that winemakers have been looking back to their own unique vinification techniques and the environmental impact. Of course, you know, Chile is a country that has been significantly impacted for drought, and they're in their 12th year of the mega sequía, the mega drought. And so old vines, in my opinion, are key to the future in terms of sustainability, because they are usually dry farmed, and Pais in particular is very drought resistant. which is why I mentioned that they're using it as rootstocks too. And most of them are kind of ploughed by horse and have, you know, very kind of manual, low impact techniques as well.
Amanda, before you move on, Wink was just saying, is that actually pressing with Zoranda or just de-stemming?
De-stemming.
Using France.
Yeah, de-stemming. I auto-corrected myself. I hope it's a de-stemmer. Naturally, you're pressing a little bit, but it's a de-stemmer. So basically, as you can see from the image, it's where the grapes will pass through the bamboo and all the stems will stay on the outside. And often in the kind of modern Pais expressions, they're adding some of the stems back in anyway. But it's a kind of nice, less aggressive way to de-stem. And I think a lot of the kind of modern ethos of Pais is gentle extraction and treating it more like a Pinot Noir in terms of, you know, really keeping those macerations quite kind of gentle. And not getting any of those green tannins that you might get from the seeds. So that's what's happening there. And then the wine that we've got here to taste, and I would certainly recommend looking for the Pais wines of Bouchon, because I think this family has been very instrumental in focusing on Pais. And Torres, again, is a really important winery in terms of kind of revaluing Pais and making different methods, sparkling Pais as well. But this one here, I pulled in a comment from the Wine Advocate, in which I think they quite nicely sum up the social impact of drinking Pais too, which is something that really has resonated with the market in the US. As you know, I think many of the millennials are quite conscientious drinkers, and so the social impact of this, it has been enormous also in terms of many of the Pais producers, the wineries working with it, are really focused on organic and sustainable viticulture too, and helping those families to retain what is normally they've been farming organically, but converting to kind of give them that added value in the marketplace. And so this one, I think if you've got the two to be able to compare, it's a really interesting comparison. So slightly different vinification techniques, but I think in Chile you get a bit more of that grip and a bit more of that kind of freshness as well. Whereas in Argentina, you often, in the Pais or Criolla Chica as it's called in Argentina, you get that softness and suppleness, both of which are very interesting expressions to enjoy. So in Chile, it's not only Pais that's important, but we've also got Moscatel de Alejandria, Pedro Jimenez, spelt differently, also native, nothing to do with the Spanish variety, Moscatel Rosado, and then they call Moscatel de Ostria. It's actually Torontes. So it's the Torontes San Juanino that you get in Argentina. And many of those will go towards their pisco production. It's really only Pais that is a significant wine production, whereas the others are largely for pisco, but also you get some nice Pedro Jimenez made in Elqui, for example, which can be very kind of, in Elqui, they can often have this slightly saline edge because of their kind of coastal position, but they're very light and crisp, mouth-watering wines. And so we've come to the end. I'm running out of time, but you know, for me, it's what I'm really excited to be able to talk to wine writers about Pais and the Criolla varieties today, is that I really think it's part of all of our kind of responsibility to take interest in native varieties around the world and kind of put more interest in just than just kind of promoting the international varieties, because I think they really do not only support so many families and livelihoods and cultures, but I think you get quite an interesting, authentic expression, in this case, of South American wine regions and varieties. So I hope that you'll be enthused to go out and try some Criolla varieties and make your own mind up about it. And if anyone has any questions or comments or wants to talk about some of the wines that they might have tried from any of these varieties, then I'll leave the floor open.
Thank you very much, Amanda. You did stall quite a number of times, so there might be people might want to just pick up on certain things in a minute, but there are just a couple of questions. One of them was from Rose when she was tasting the Chica Criolla. She was asking you what you would suggest serving with that wine.
So I quite like, I mean, for me, I would go with chorizo. So I'd go with a proper, like, juicy Argentine style chorizo sausage, which normally has quite a high quantity of fat, because I think there is a bit of grip to it. And it's also kind of got that softness and earthiness, which means you don't want anything too strong, but I think you want something with a bit of fat. And for me, like a typical Argentine choripan, which is, you know, this chorizo in pan, so in bread. So it's basically a kind of Argentine hot dog, but totally different. You have this grilled bread, this smoky, juicy, slightly fatty sausage, and then a bit of chimichurri, which is your sauce made of kind of fresh pepper and oregano and vinegar to kind of keep it lively. Something like that for me would be ideal. Or like empanadas, you know, I think these are not complicated wines, so they don't need anything with too much, you don't want anything with too much weight or volume in the mouth. You want something that is kind of easy to eat and will match nicely with this, that can cut through a little bit of the fat. But Rose, if you have any thoughts yourself, then I'd love to know what you might try pairing it with.
Well, I was interested because they do taste quite different, those two, you know, the two different reds that you gave us. And I was quite interested because I think that they probably would go with different foods. I mean, you've got a lot more experience on the ground in terms of what they match with. I mean, my sort of initial thing was probably charcuterie, but I think you probably need to expand that a bit. But what about the Chilean país? What would you reckon with that?
Well, this one for me has a bit more grip to it.
It does, yeah.
And a bit more acidity. So there, I think you can get a bit more, you can go more in that kind of roasted meat, kind of like lamb, or maybe like some, yeah, they've got some lovely like lamb in Chile and things like that, which I think, or llama, like, now I sound like an absolute carnivore, but they also have very interesting dishes that they'll produce with llama and different guanaco as well, which is quite a lean meat, but also has that slightly kind of gamey flavors, which would be quite nice with this because it's a little bit more complex and has a bit more kind of grip and freshness to it, which I think would go nicely with some kind of meat dishes. But then, you know, also in terms of kind of, they've got this really, I'm trying to think of some vegetarian options as well, but they have some very interesting kind of smoked potato dishes in the south of Chile, which actually might be quite nice to have those kind of more kind of smoked and complex smells and flavors, but with kind of vegetables as well would be quite nice. But for me, when I drink país in Argentina and Chile, it's often, you know, with a picada, so exactly as you said, charcuterie, and with the torrontés and some of the white país varieties like Pedro Jimenez. I just love it with the local goat's cheese and sprinkled with some kind of herbs and some lovely kind of local olive oil as well. So I think with the kind of the more neutral white Criolla varieties, you can go with something like that. And then torrontés, you know, as you can taste from the Chicana one, is one that definitely can hold up to a lot more interesting kind of exotic flavors. So in Argentina and Chile, they love to serve torrontés with sushi because you get those kind of much more interesting, you know, you can hold up to more exotic aromas, and Asian cuisine, Thai as well, works really nicely. And torrontés is very easy. It's not a challenging wine. So actually with spicy foods, it can work quite nicely too, I think.
Sorry, I got a bit lost when you were talking about the torrontés. When you put up the thing, you said it was from, is that from the Torrontés Mendocino?
No, so that's a confusing thing about torrontés. There are 3 varieties.
Yeah.
They are identified by the regions that they originally came from.
Yeah.
So torrontés riojano, which originally would have grown in La Rioja, or found in La Rioja, but it's the most widely planted.
Yeah.
So the torrontés that you're tasting, and most of the torrontéses that you will taste, are torrontés riojano.
Right, so that one was riojano, right? Okay.
Yes, grown anywhere. So in the Uco Valley, also in Salta and the Calchaquí valleys, And then you've got Dorontes Sanjuanino, which is the second most grown, but much less important because it's less aromatic and it's a bit wider in the palate. But that one, the Sanjuanino, is still mainly grown in San Juan and Mendoza. And then you've got Dorontes Mendocino, which originally came from Mendoza, but is now, you know, very kind of low in plantation and isn't the better quality Dorontes. And actually, they believe it's got a different parentage. They don't know the parentage for that one yet. So you're very unlikely to taste Dorontes Mendocino, but you're very likely to taste Dorontes Riojano from Mendoza.
The reason I was curious, because you said during your thing, you said, you notice there's no mention of floral at all, although actually I thought it was a bit floral.
Yeah, no, Dorontes for me is always floral.
But you said in her note, there's no mention of floral, it's all sort of citrus.
Yeah.
And that's because, and I thought that it was a different Dorontes, so it is actually the same.
Oh, it's the same. I meant that as a regional difference. Oh, so I think it's floral. For me, Dorontes is always floral. It's one of the trademark aromas, those white blossom or jasmine.
Definitely, yeah.
But I think when you kind of compare them, you will find that actually the ones from the north are more floral and kind of exotic fruit, and the ones from the south are floral as well, but citrus focused as well. So that's what I meant. I apologize that I wasn't very clear.
No, thank you. That's great.
You have those regional differences. So you'll always have the kind of trademark DNA of Dorontes, which for me are floral notes, and that very flamboyant nose. And then you'll get subtle regional differences, which would be citrus fruit, normally in Mendoza, and then more kind of tropical fruit, lychee in Salta, for example. But there's a huge range of, you know, of different expressions, and it obviously depends on when you pick it as well. But kind of broad stroke summaries, that's what I would say the regional differences.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Keith's got a quick question. Keith, do you want to go ahead and ask Amanda?
Hi, Amanda. Do the Dorontes varieties have more resistance to Maguro vitis, which I understand is a problem in parts of Chile, or maybe a blessing, depending which way you look at it, because it helps keep yields down a little bit.
The Dorontes or Criolla?
Criolla, sorry.
Yes, I believe they do. I'm not a scientist by any means, but in the interviews that I've had with winemakers, and especially Sebastian Labe will talk about it in Santa Rita with their biggery plant. They found that País does have much more resistance. And as you said, that is a big issue in Chile. And so that's why they've been using País roots, root stocks in order to plant on, as well as testing some of the other root stocks available internationally. But they've also found that, you know, País, which is one of the Criolla varieties, has this natural resistance to it. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and then Angela Lloyd had a quick question. She's not unmuted, so I'll ask. She asked, is the Moscatel in Bolivia the same as Muscat d'Alexandrie or Hanapur?
Yes.
It is.
Okay. I mean, we think so. With all of these things, you need to take it all with a pinch of salt, because most producers have not had their vines studied to double check their genetics. But the understanding is that Moscatel de Alejandria in Bolivia is the same as Muscat of Alexandria. However, you may well find many kind of crossings in vineyards. And actually, when you look at people's registers in Bolivia, they will often kind of give different names to some of their different vines because they act differently. And so that may well be that they were crossed at some point. But in theory, yes. INTA in Mendoza, which is the research institute there, has been working very closely with producers in Bolivia and also Peru in order to start really mapping out the kind of family tree of Criolla. And actually that's where I developed my family tree, was with one of their engineers and researchers there, Gustavo Alicchio. If you want to read any of his research papers, And so they've been working very hard, but it is the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more that needs to be done in order to really understand how many native varieties we have and how widely planted they are. But that's something that is kind of, you know, people are paying more attention to, and hopefully as we kind of put more focus on it, we'll get a greater understanding of that. But he thinks there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different varieties. You're on mute now, Andrea.
So I think we all need to buy your book now.
Oh, and you really don't have to, but a lot of this information is available on the website for free. So if anyone wants to read up on Criolla, then you'll find my kind of guide to Criolla varieties, and I've also got the A to Z for South American varieties there too. And then you all know where to reach me, and I'm always keen to talk about Criolla or anything South America, so just drop me an email.
Amanda, can you, if you can hear us, because you seem to have frozen again, can you give us some...
Guide. There's a lot of wines that I recommend. So if you want to start kind of tasting around, then please have a look and see what's available. For me, it's fascinating that, for example, Aldi in the UK has brought in a Criolla as one of their wines. And so that excites me, that actually we might see this kind of come more into the mainstream. Because it will have a significant social impact in Argentina and Chile. So fingers crossed that we're at the brink of a big Criolla revival.
I had a question sort of linked to that, Amanda. What is the overall position at the moment? Are Criolla grapes being replanted, vines being replanted, or are there international varieties taking over?
I lost the end of your question, but I assume it was if they're being pulled out, and they are. We're losing vines at quite a rapid rate in Argentina and Chile, and that's due to a number of reasons. Firstly, obviously, Criolla isn't very well understood on the export markets, and so there's not much demand for it, although that is changing in the US with País, for example, where there is a growing demand for it. But also very significantly, local consumption is going down for wine. And so these Criolla varieties really have always been boom and bust with local consumption, especially in Argentina, where you can kind of track that with their own economic booms and busts. And so we are losing Criolla varieties and old vines at quite a rapid rate in both Argentina and Chile. But many winemakers are really trying to make it their focus to help empower growers, pay better prices, and try and keep some of these old vines. And inevitably, we are going to lose a lot of land, especially with varieties like Cereza. And, you know, I think that's not always the worst thing, but I think it's really important to try and maintain a proportion of that in order to kind of retain that heritage and also the kind of culture around it. And hopefully with more interest from this new generation of winemakers, we're starting to see that. So hopefully the tide is changing, but it is still an outgoing tide, if that's the right way to express that.
That's a shame.
It is. We can change it, Liz. Come on, jump on the Criolla bandwagon.
Oh, well, I have recommended País a couple of times. I think they're lovely examples. I think it's principally the Torres ones I've encountered, and they've been very good.
Yeah, Torres do a great job, and their most exported País is actually a sparkling rosé, the Estelado País, which is lovely. It's a really nice, you know, it's made in a traditional method. So it does have some kind of structure and complexity to it, but it's a nice kind of fragrant, you know, strawberry dominated, lovely kind of light summer rosé, sparkling rosé, with a little bit of that yeasty complexity, very much made with the kind of carver method in mind. So I recommend looking out for that one. I used to have it for a lot of brunches in Chile. It's a good brunch wine.
There's just a couple of questions. You answered Leona's question. Do countries do anything specifically to preserve their old vines? And you were saying, obviously, they give incentives to the growers, etc.
Yeah, there's no government, there's no institutional focus on that.
Right.
But Pro Chile in Chile has actually started to award certain producers for certain projects, which might be focused on something related to Criolla, but not necessarily. There isn't much institutional support. It's very much focused on producers themselves or winemakers.
Okay. It's just Meg and Rose are both asking about your self-publishing. They're both asking you to talk briefly about your research and writing process for the book and being such a big project.
Yes, I did speak to some publishers before, and to be honest, I just didn't find that the deal was very kind of good. I didn't want to give up intellectual property or creative control. It's something that obviously I'm very passionate about and have spent the last 10 years living there and researching. And so, you know, I wanted to write a book which in my mind would give enough space to actually talk about these different wine countries like Peru and Bolivia, which are often overlooked. So my decision to self-publish was on the advice of some of our members. Wink was very helpful. Also Simon Wolf was very helpful in giving me some advice about how to kind of tackle self-publishing. And wasn't easy. And it still isn't easy, but I'm glad that I did, because I really wanted to have that creative freedom to kind of make the book as big or colourful as I wanted to, and so that's largely why I chose to self-publish, and it was always going to be a mammoth task in order to kind of do the cartography, for example. A lot of these maps haven't been mapped out before. They're wine regions that just haven't ever had any wine maps made of them, so that was a real kind of labour of love, working with winemakers all over the continent and sending them WhatsApps with screenshots and asking them to mark on their vineyard, and we got there in the end, and hopefully, you know, that's something we continue to kind of make more profound each edition, and so that was largely my kind of decision and process, was to have that freedom, and so yeah, so hopefully, you know, I hope that it gives a platform for producers to help kind of talk about their wines, and you know, show the world that South America is a very serious wine continent, with long history, and you know, there is plenty of kind of information to actually, you know, take these wines seriously, which I think unfortunately it's kind of gone under the radar, perhaps because we haven't had much literature about it. So I just hope that it will give that kind of opportunity to really improve the kind of the ability for South American wines to kind of be exported and understood in different marketplaces around the world.
Well, I think
if there was any more specific question, let me know.
It certainly is. Looking at the book, it's a beautiful book and it's a testament to your passion of South American wines. But obviously any members that want to see anything on self-publishing, Stephen Quinn and Wink Lork did do a seminar on the 24th of July last year, so that recording is on the website if anybody is keen to learn a little bit more about self-publishing. So sorry, Wink.
I just wanted to say I've only just had a look at the final result of the book, and it just it's obviously a labor of love. It's absolutely huge and heavy and beautiful, and there's so much exciting stuff to dip into, I think, in there, so timely as well. So many congratulations. Trust me, I know that it's not easy. It's also very hard to distribute. Amanda has chosen for the moment not to work with Amazon, which is a brave decision, and I understand that decision. And so the other thing that I'm really impressed by is that you've got sections of it available as PDFs. Are they PDFs or are they ebook downloads in other ways?
Thank you, I appreciate your comment. Yes, I have the ebook available online on my own website, but I am using the monster that is Amazon for the Kindle version.
Yeah.
If anyone wants a Kindle version, then they can use Amazon. But unfortunately, the margins just it's not financially viable for me to sell it for much less than £35, and it would be £95 on Amazon, which I just think is outrageous. The margins just make it kind of inhumane to try and sell a book. But well, fingers crossed, we'll see what happens afterwards. But yeah, thank you, Wink, I appreciate that, and also all your advice in the process.
Also, I wanted to say to members that I have pushed Amanda to make sure, because she's editor of the circular, there is going to be a review in the circular of her book, and she's going to be reproducing an amazing review that some of you might have already read on Jansis's site by Tamlin Curran, who is a really hard reviewer. I find it very scary when she reviews my book, and so well done for that as well.
Thank you, Wink.
Fantastic, thank you, Wink.
I guess we're reaching the end of our time now, so we have to draw this really fascinating session to a close. Amanda, thank you so much. That's been absolutely illuminating. I've learned so much. I'm sure everyone else has. Many congratulations on your book, and a huge thank you for you to come and talk to us in such detail. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Nice to see everyone. I hope you all have a nice weekend.